So, good evening, everyone. Shweta, am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, thank you all for joining in for today's module. We have reached module 6 of the course. Good to see you all back after, I think, almost 1.5 months. And I hope all of you are safe with the pandemic craze going on. I hope wherever you all are safe and you continue to take good precautions to keep your and your family safe. So good to see that we've reached module 6, which means we have crossed half the journey in this course. And in another 1 month, I think you all will be wrapping up. So today, the topic that we are going to be discussing is HIV prevention and pre and post exposure prophylaxis. Now, in this module, there were 2 videos which were uploaded on the Canvas. I'm not sure if you all had the time to go through it. So there was one by Brian Wood, where he, I think it's a 1 hour module on where he talks about the pre-exposure prophylaxis. And there is one by Dr. Budak, where she speaks about the post-exposure prophylaxis. I think both of them are about 1 hour videos. And if you all have gone through it, I'm sure this session today is going to be like more of a revision. And if not, I think again, this session will help you all to move through the videos pretty quickly once you go back. So our major objective here would be to first understand what PrEP is, that is pre-exposure prophylaxis. Now, this is something that does not exist in our program right now, but talks are already underway and we may expect the guideline on PrEP very soon in our NACO program as well. So here we are basically going to be dealing with what the US follows for the purpose of discussion because PrEP is already being implemented there. So we are going to be more so looking at the US guidelines. We'll be discussing about who can take PrEP, what are the challenges, are there any concerns, and what is the future of PrEP? So what are the new formulations which are coming up? And after that, we'll be moving to the concept of post-exposure prophylaxis, which already exists in our NACO program. So basically, we are going to be looking at when post-exposure prophylaxis will be needed. What is the benefit? Are there any risks involved? And before we conclude the session, we are going to discuss the concept of U equals U, which is undetectable is equal to untransmittable. I mean, this concept is pretty much well understood, I think, by all of us right now, but we would take about 5-10 minutes to discuss that concept as well before we conclude the session. So we begin with PrEP, that is pre-exposure prophylaxis. Again, like I mentioned, this is not there in our guidelines right now, but it is good to understand the science behind this and the evidence behind PrEP, because very soon, like I said, we may expect it to be rolled out in our program as well. So what is the difference between post-exposure and pre-exposure prophylaxis? Now, the name says it all. So post-exposure means we are giving the prophylaxis after the exposure. So we can see here, the red arrow indicates the exposure. So in post-exposure prophylaxis, the prophylaxis begins after the exposure, and it is usually given for a limited period of time. Whereas in pre-exposure prophylaxis, the idea is to start the prophylaxis before the exposure. So you can see that the blue arrow begins before the red one. And the idea of giving pre-exposure prophylaxis is we are expecting that this particular client is going to be subjected to multiple exposures in future. And hence, we want to give pre-exposure prophylaxis so that the client remains protected throughout, even though the exposures are going to be multiple. So this is the basic difference between post-exposure and pre-exposure prophylaxis. So what is PrEP? So PrEP is basically a prevention strategy in which a high-risk individual takes medication regularly along with the usual traditional risk reduction strategies to prevent HIV infection. Now, what are the keywords here? First is PrEP is not something that we are advocating for the general population. This is something that we are targeting for high-risk individuals who have a substantial higher risk of contracting HIV. Secondly, what is important in PrEP is it must be taken regularly, which means adherence. Like we talk about ART adherence, it is also important that the person taking PrEP is adherent to his medication. Otherwise, there is no point in taking the prophylaxis. And the third important point here is it is not an isolated strategy. So it doesn't mean that if we are giving PrEP, the client, we can give them 100% guarantee that they are not going to be getting HIV and they can continue with, risky behavior. So the point here is, even though we are giving PrEP, the risk reduction strategies, the traditional risk reduction strategies must be advocated and the client must be counseled for the same. Now, another one important point here when we talk about high risk individual is, so PrEP is not something that is permanent. So it doesn't mean that if I start PrEP in an individual, that individual is going to take PrEP lifelong. The idea is the risk may vary. The same person who was high risk today may have a lower risk 3 months down the line or 6 months down the line. And at that time, we must reconsider whether PrEP should be given or not. So that is something that we need to remember, that depending upon the risk status of the individual, PrEP must either be given or not given. Now, which are the two major drug combinations used in the United States for PrEP? So the older one is, it goes by the brand name Truvada, which contains emtricitabine and tenofovir, but the form of tenofovir is tenofovir disoproxil fumarate, that is TDF. So this was the earlier drug which is used. And as late as 2019, there was a new formulation which was approved, which goes by the brand name Descovy. So this Descovy contains emtricitabine and tenofovir, but the component of tenofovir that we are using is tenofovir alafenamide. So we will discuss very soon about both these components. What is TDF, what is TAF, and what are the differences? But just for the understanding right now, so there are two drug combinations which are approved in the United States. The older one goes by the brand name Truvada, and the newer one goes by the brand name Descovy. So how did we get the evidence, or why is it that PrEP was started, or what was the evidence? Now there are a lot of studies that you can see over here. And for each study, if you require more details, the studies are uploaded in your Canvas. So for any, deeper information that you would like to dig in, please feel free to open up these studies and have a look. Many of them, they're pretty interesting to read and to gain a better understanding. For the purpose of today's session, I will just highlight a few, like for example, what is being discussed here. So please remember that all these studies we are discussing about the use of tenofovir disoproxil fumarate and emtricitabine, or the older combination, that is Truvada. Now these are not the studies for the newer formulation. This is for the older formulation. So for example, if you take the first study, which is the IPREC study. So here what was done? The study population was about 2,500 MSM and transgender population, and they had two study arms. So two arms. So one of the arms, they were given daily oral Truvada combination, and the other one was a placebo. Now we can see that wherever Truvada was given, there was a 44% reduced HIV incidence. Similarly, if we talk about the next study, which is the partner PrEP study, which was done in Africa, here they took heterosexual discordant couples, which means that one couple was HIV positive and the other was negative, and they had three study arms. So there was one arm where only oral tenofovir was given, one arm where Truvada was given, and one arm where placebo was given. Now there is significant reduction in HIV incidence in both the tenofovir and the Truvada arms, about 67 to 75%. Now, similarly, if we look at the other studies, be it the TDF2 study in Botswana or the Bangkok study again emphasizes because they used IDUs as their study population. The takeaway from here is, if you look at the last column, there is a significant reduction in HIV incidence wherever the PrEP was used. So this was one of the major reasons why, it built in more evidence for using PrEP. Now, if we all note the last two studies here, which is the FEM-PrEP study and the VOICE study, here mainly the study population were women. And fortunately or unfortunately, when you look at the HIV incidence, it says that there was no protection. Now, what does this mean? So this does not mean that the TDF FTC combination was not working. The point was, once they understood while doing the study that no significant impact is being seen, they started digging out more. They did a more qualitative analysis of what was actually happening. And finally, they came to know that the adherence of PrEP in the study population was, in both the studies, just ranged between 40 to 50%. So it was but obvious that when people are not adherent to PrEP, the effect is not going to be seen. And when they dived in deeper to understand what was the issue and why there was no adherence, our, the age-old topic of stigma came into picture. So the idea was that the women, they couldn't even keep the PrEP bottles at home and they couldn't justify why they were taking this medication. That indirectly led to poor adherence. And finally, there was no impact seen. So this basically shows, so overall, we can see that all the major RCTs which were done, be it in, and the major RCTs, you can also note that these were done in the high risk population, like your MSM, your transgender women, your serodiscordant couples, IDUs. And that is exactly in whom we are indicating or we want PrEP to be given. So what is the other thing that we concluded from the study? Like we said, adherence is important. And how was that seen? You can see the various bar charts here. Let me now, like we just discussed in the previous slide, the FEM-PrEP study and the VOICE study, you can see that adherence was just 15 to 20% in many cases. And hence, we didn't see the impact in HIV incidence that we wanted to see. But when you talk about the partners PrEP study again, what is this 90%? This 90% shows that there was 90% reduction in HIV incidence. What is the difference in the darker bar and the lighter bar? The lighter bar shows you the effect on HIV incidence or the reduction in HIV incidence when patients were adherent to the PrEP medication. So what you can just see is that if people are adherent to PrEP, the HIV incidence can be reduced from 90 to 92%. So this is a big takeaway for us that even if PrEP is given, adherence is very, very important. So with all this, FDA, after we came to know that, okay, PrEP is actually beneficial, in October 2019, FDA approved the second drug, which is the new drug that we are talking about, tenofovir alafenamide. So what is the basic difference between both these components, TAF and TDF? So all of us know that tenofovir is the most widely used medication, not only for HIV, it also works for hepatitis B. And this drug is also approved for pre-exposure prophylaxis. So there are two forms of the drug which are available. One is the older one, which is tenofovir disoproxil fumarate, and the new one, TAF, which is tenofovir alafenamide. Now, what is tenofovir alafenamide? It is a prodrug and it is absorbed more quickly than TDF. And another good thing is it produces much higher levels of the active drug, which is called tenofovir diphosphate. So whatever be the formulation of tenofovir that you're giving, ultimately in the blood, it has to get converted to the active drug, which is tenofovir diphosphate. And the advantage of TAF is that it is absorbed more quickly and it leads to higher levels of this active drug in the peripheral blood cells, which means that even small doses of TAF is enough because it has this capacity to produce higher levels of the drug. So if we are giving TDF in the range 300 milligrams, TAF you can give it even as a 25 milligram component. So again, what is the advantage of giving it in smaller doses? It leads to lower drug levels in the blood, and hence exposure to other organs like your kidneys or bones or other organs gets minimized. So what does again this mean? It means that though the drug has good effect in countering your HIV virus, at the same time, it will reduce the exposure to other organs and therefore bring down the side effects tremendously. But vis-a-vis, if you also consider TDF, obviously TDF also comes with its own benefits. And we know that TDF, it leads to lower cholesterol levels. And therefore, it considerably reduces the cardiovascular risk. And that beneficial effect we don't see in TAF. Also, the TAF component may give rise to a slight weight gain. Now, this is just a comparison between what TAF is and what TDF is. There is nothing like you cannot overpower saying TAF is better or TDF is better. And we will see why that is so in the next few slides. So, which was the study because of which the new drug that is Descovy got approved in the US? So, this study is called the Discover study. It is again a huge RCT. It was a multinational double-blind study where they compared both the drugs. That is, in one arm, you had the older Truvada formulation, which is emtricitabine with TDF. And in the other arm, you had the new combination, which is Descovy, which is emtricitabine with TAF. The study was mainly done, it was done in the MSM and transgender population. But one significant thing that we need to remember here, and I will tell you why, is they excluded people who had a GFR less than 60. So now when the study was done, they had approximately 2,694 in each of the arms. And once the study was done, what was the result which was seen? So they saw that in the FTC TAF arm, that is the new drug, the Descovy drug, we got about 7 HIV infections per 4,370 person years. And when you compare it with your older combination, that is Truvada, Truvada showed 15 infections in 4,386 person years. Can we jump into any conclusion by looking at this graph? No. The point is here you can see something called the incidence rate ratio, which is shown as 0.47. This is nothing but your 0.16 divided by 0.34. Now, before they started this study, there was a pre-specified criteria for non-inferiority, which shows IRR, and that pre-specified criteria is incidence rate ratio should be less than 1.62. And from the study, they got an incidence rate ratio of 0.47, which is obviously less than 1.62. So the only thing that we can conclude from this study is not that TAF is better. We can only say that the TAF is non-inferior than your TDF. What does non-inferior mean? In layman terms, both are equally effective. So here, another thing that we need to highlight here is in each of the arms, there was one new infection which occurred even with adequate drug levels. What does that mean? So PrEP was given, the patients were adherent to their PrEP, whether it be Truvada, whether it be Descovy, there was one infection which occurred in both the arms, even though the client was completely adherent to PrEP. What does this mean? So this means that, like we said, nothing comes with a 100% guarantee. The reason we say this is because, again, in PrEP, we are giving 2 drugs. There could be a chance that the client who is taking PrEP is exposed to an HIV strain that is already resistant to both the drugs that you're giving in PrEP. If that is the case, the person may still have an HIV infection in spite of being adherent to PrEP. So that is a reason we always say that when PrEP is given, do not forget to counsel that the other traditional risk reduction behavior has to continue in the client. So other results that we got from the Discover study was, like we discussed in the formulation of TAF. TAF was more favorable when it came to results of bone mineral density, of GFR. And like we said, because theoretically we said that because it converts to the active drug pretty quickly, the effects on other organs are pretty less. And that can also be seen in this study. So what did we come, what was the conclusion? So the conclusion here was, we cannot say that Descovy is better or not better. We can only say that the Descovy combination is non-inferior to the Truvada combination. And what is important is this study was basically done in the MSM and transgender women. Both the drugs were very well tolerated, but if you see the bone and renal outcomes, they were more favorable for TAF. And thirdly, the high risk sexual behavior was constant, which means there was no evidence of risk compensation in either study arm. So this is something that we are going to be discussing later, but just to highlight here, risk compensation means that sometimes we feel that because we are giving PrEP to a client, the client is so confident that the PrEP is going to work that he or she may indulge in high risk practices, high risk behavior more than what he or she was doing before PrEP. But many studies have proved that that is not the case in reality. And in fact, people who are taking PrEP, they have reduced risk, high risk behavior than what they did before using PrEP. So finally, in the guidelines, they came to when it was approved, when Descovy was approved, it was approved for adults and adolescents more than equal to or more than 35 kg and who are at sexual risk of acquiring HIV. But remember, it excludes vaginal sex. Because the study was done on MSM and transgender population, we do not have evidence to say that Descovy will be equally protective even for vaginal sex, and hence it is not recommended for the same. And what is the dosing that is given? It is a daily dosing and not on demand. Now, on demand dosing is something that we will be discussing in a few slides from now. So I'll not take it up right now. So yes, Descovy was approved, but what was a major concern? The first question mark was, how did the approval come just from one RCT? So this was pretty surprising even in the US scenario, because normally they would require at least 2 or more than 2 RCTs in order for the FDA to approve anything. But just with this Discover study, Descovy was approved. Secondly, there is a limited follow-up for this study. So we do not know the long-term outcomes of Descovy. And the study population which was used were primarily the young and otherwise healthy people, and especially nobody with renal insufficiency. Like I told you while discussing the study, the exclusion criteria was the EGFR less than 60, which means, so the idea is, suppose we get this new drug. Now we know that versus if we compare it with TDF, TAF is actually a better option for people with renal insufficiency. Why? Because its impact is not much on your kidneys. That is what we just learned. But if my study population didn't include that at all, they did not include people with renal insufficiency, which means, again, I don't have data to say that TAF can be used in this population. So that was another major concern for Descovy. And like we just discussed, it is not, we do not have data for the HIV transmission happening through the vaginal sex route. So again, Descovy cannot be used there. And plus, it does come with a little concern of weight gain and lipid abnormalities. So these are the concern with regard to the new drug for PrEP. And another thing is, though it has been FDA approved, it is not yet incorporated into the CDC PrEP guidelines. So, I mean, if you look at the CDC document, I think the last that was updated was in 2018. And this FDA drug got approved, Descovy got approved in 2019. So it is yet to be incorporated in the CDC guideline. And plus, like we said earlier, even if it has to be prescribed, it has to be prescribed as a daily dosing medicine and not 211. Now, what do we mean by 211? So this is something called an on-demand dosing. So for some drugs, like for the earlier drug in Truvada, there are studies where a person could take 2 tablets of Truvada 2 to 24 hours before your sexual act or before the high risk behavior. After that, one drug or one tablet is taken 24 hours from the first dose, and the second tablet is taken 48 hours from the first dose. So this is called the 2-1-1 dosing. And there are various studies which are pro or against. So we do not have a clear-cut conclusion about how effective 2-1-1 is. But as far as Descovy is concerned, it will be taken as a daily dose medicine. So what are the recent trends? And just to review, what are the guidelines which already exist for PrEP? So in the US, people attribute the decrease in HIV incidence a large extent to the use of PrEP, because according to the studies done there, the uptake of PrEP has dramatically increased. However, it still remains underutilized. So the issue of access, the issue of disparity, the issue of difference in access between different races or the age group or the gender population or the geographic region, that exists even in the US. So the point is, there are a lot of geographies or a lot of subgroup of population who are actually eligible for PrEP, but they still don't get it, which means that PrEP is still largely underutilized in the States. And one of the major reasons that they came up with is also the awareness issue. So there was a survey which was taken for all the physicians, or like many physicians in the US. And it was surprising that about 35% of those physicians didn't even know what PrEP was, and they had never heard of it. So which again, I mean, it is an awareness issue, and that could also be attributed to the underutilization of PrEP. And also for people who are aware, so about 64% people who are aware, they thought that adherence is a major concern in PrEP, and also the cost implication. So that could be one of the reasons again why PrEP is underutilized. And when we look at the client section of, or the client aspect of PrEP, again in a survey, it was many people, I mean many clients mainly had issues regarding cost. Secondly, they didn't know where PrEP was available, and the major concern was also about the side effects of PrEP. So these are just things to understand why, because like I said, we do not have PrEP as yet in our guidelines. But yes, these are some of the concerns and challenges that we also need to understand, and we also need to try and reduce it before we introduce something like this into our program. So this is like a lot of takeaway messages of what we can learn from mistakes that is happening elsewhere. So these, like I said, are the guidelines in CDC. The older one is the 2014, and the latest one was published in 2018. And Descovy right now is not a part of the CDC guidelines. So finally, who should actually be considering PrEP? Again, I'm reiterating, these are only for individuals who have a substantial risk of contracting the infection. This is not something that can be prescribed to the general population. So some of the examples for whom you would be giving this is someone who's in a sexual relationship with a positive person. So here in this case, it is something like a serodiscordant couple. So MSMs who are not in a monogamous relationship, or they are not using condoms always, people or high risk clients with STIs in the last 6 months, people who inject drugs. Again, one need here, or one thing that Brian Wood talks about in his lecture, is also about recurrent need for post-exposure prophylaxis. So if a client is coming to you with repeated exposures, and after every exposure he or she wants to continue the post-exposure prophylaxis, we rather advocate and counsel the person for the pre-exposure prophylaxis. So these are some of the examples. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are just examples of where you can consider giving PrEP. But what is important? Can you just directly write the medication or prescribe the medication and send it to the patient? No. First is determine the eligibility. Choose the right patient for PrEP. Not only, now this does not mean that you can give PrEP to all the high risk individuals in your center. They must be able to take this pill every day. They must be able to return every 3 months to your clinic for regular assessment. Screening for HIV has to be done before you start PrEP, because if a patient is HIV positive, we should actually put him on the 3-drug ART and not on the 2-drug PrEP. And finally, what is very important is you also check for hepatitis B. Now, the point here why hepatitis B is important is the drugs that we are using for PrEP, it also acts against hepatitis B. So suppose there was a patient who comes to you and you advocate PrEP in the patient, but and the patient has an underlying hepatitis B infection. If we do not check for that, because the patient is taking PrEP, his hepatitis B will also be under check because the medication is working for hepatitis B as well. But the moment you decide to stop PrEP for the individual, for whatever reason, it could be that the person turns out to be HIV positive, or the patient, has come from a high risk to a low risk category, or any other reason, if we decide to stop PrEP, then there could be a flaring up of hepatitis B had we not checked it before. So the idea is why we are doing this is, and in case the patient is positive for hepatitis B, so we can give PrEP, the PrEP continues, but we must remember that if we are going to stop PrEP for that individual, medication or treatment for hepatitis B must continue in that individual. So that is why it's very important to actually determine the correct eligibility of the patient. Again, when you are prescribing the tablet, not we, I mean, according to the guidelines, Truvada is given 1 tablet daily. And what they advocate there is you do not give more than 90 pills at a time. Why? Because we want the person to come back to the clinic every 3 months for continuous counseling, for follow up, for reassessment. That has to continue. And it is always important to emphasize adherence, because if people are not adherent to PrEP, the ultimate aim of giving PrEP itself is gone away. Hence, continuous counseling is very, very important. Again, not to say, I mean, not to repeat, but it is important to counsel them to continue with risk reduction behavior, because please remember that PrEP is not a standalone strategy. If you're only going to rely on PrEP, we cannot reduce HIV incidence. And like I talked about laboratory monitoring, every 3 months, the patient has to be called, HIV testing has to be done, STI screening has to be done, and we must also monitor renal function because we are giving tenofovir. So how soon does PrEP actually reach your, the effective levels? Now, we do not have a clear-cut answer for this. We just have 2 different guidelines. So according to CDC, what does CDC say? CDC says that to reach maximum intracellular concentration in the rectal tissue, the PrEP, it takes 7 days, and in cervical, vaginal tissue, or in the blood, it takes 20 days. Now, this 7 days and 20 days, according to CDC, is for the maximum concentration. How much concentration do we need to stop HIV from occurring? We don't know. It could be much lesser than this also. So we do not have a clear-cut evidence. But according to the IAS USA guidelines, what they propose is there has to be at least a 1-week lead-in time. So which means that relatively at least give a week for a decent effective level to attain. And for discontinuing, that again, the guidelines are different. For CDC, they recommend 28 days after the last sex. And for the IAS USA guidelines, they recommend 1 week after the last sex. Now, these are just different guidelines. But the thing that we need to remember is we do not actually know when the effective levels will start. So is it safe? Now the concern, what is the major concern about PrEP? One of it is, will it lead to drug resistance? Because we are going to just give it in an HIV negative individual. We are going to be giving PrEP in an HIV negative individual, and we are going to be treating him with 2 drugs for prophylaxis. Is there any chance that this will lead to drug resistance? Is there any chance that this will lead to increased riskier behavior? So that was one of the major concerns. So for the first concern, whether is it safe or not, definitely it is safe. When you start PrEP, yes, definitely there is something called a startup syndrome where people may come to you with nausea, headache, or fatigue. But generally, any over the counter medicine helps for that. And when we talk about renal and bone safety, it is relatively safe because whatever data in the trials, whatever data that we have, there is not much difference in what your Truvada arm shows versus what the placebo arm shows when it comes to renal safety and effect on the bones. So we really don't need to worry about the safety of PrEP. The second question is about drug resistance. So here, there are large PrEP trials which have been conducted, and the incidence of HIV resistance is very, very low. So there is no reported data that have evaluated, HIV drug resistance in patients taking PrEP, but it is very low. And the idea of, like, even if we want to be very safe, what we need to do is identify HIV promptly in that person. So what the here comes the emphasis or the importance of regular monitoring. Now, because that patient is taking PrEP, we cannot say, oh yeah, you continue taking PrEP, you can come and meet me after 6 months. We cannot do that. Why? Because in case while taking PrEP, if the patient turns out to be positive for HIV, we must stop PrEP and start ART. So to minimize this risk of drug resistance, the things that we can do are, at a time, we don't give more than 90 days of medication, and we keep repeating the HIV test every 3 months, or whenever the patient develops any symptoms that are suggestive of HIV. The idea is to catch the HIV infection early, and as early as you catch the infection, you put them on your regular ARV treatment so that we avoid the development of drug resistance. And thirdly, the concern was about risky behavior. Now, like I already said, now these are just some graphs to show that once the patient is started on PrEP, the risky behavior, or the high risk behavior of using of unprotected sex, it actually reduces. Now, why does this happen? So people who have done the studies, they would like to believe that the person whom you are giving PrEP to, first of all, is thoroughly counseled. Secondly, we are giving them the confidence that if you take this medication, you are going to protect your partner from getting the infection. Thirdly, they are going to keep coming back to you every 3 months. So when they keep coming back to you, it means they get more time to interact with you. You are going to counsel them more. And that, in fact, increases the awareness about how their behavior should be, how the adherence should be. And all these factors put together, when you look at the data from the clinical trials, it actually shows that the high risk behavior after PrEP, in fact, reduces, which is again a good sign for prescribing PrEP. So again, PrEP, it comes with a lot of benefits as well. Some of the benefits, I mean, obviously, is that you are more confident, there is less anxiety, and there is increased trust. Your issues of communication disclosure becomes better. So there are a lot of benefits that come along with PrEP, which is more so the social benefits. So what are the controversies, and what is the future? So yes, though we have spoken about PrEP, there are a lot of questions for which we still don't have answers. First, like I told about, what is the role of intermittent dosing? We spoke about the 2-1-1 dosing, but we do not have enough data to tell us whether that is really useful or not. Secondly, the question that we already discussed, how soon after a person starts PrEP is it protective? We do not have a number for this. What are the benefits for an individual whose partner has HIV with a suppressed viral load? So like on one end, we are discussing that if there is undetected viral load in a serodiscordant couple, if the positive person has undetected viral load, then it is untransmittable. He is not going to transmit the infection. So even in that case, do you think PrEP is necessary? Is PrEP going to give any additional benefits over and above this? We don't know. Again, we need more studies and more data to answer that question. And what is the best use of FTC TAF, that is Descovy? and what is its long-term benefits. We still do not, we just have that one study, Discover study. We do not know the long-term benefits of TAF, so we need to wait and watch. Is same day prep safe and feasible? Now, again, we do not have a lot of studies, but this is one question that needs to be answered, that, again, it is related to how soon is prep going to be effective after you take it. So that will also decide or give an answer to this question. And when will long acting injectable prep be available? Now, this is definitely, if it comes in, it is going to be a boon. Like you can see over here, this is something what the future will look like. We already have the PrEP pill, and there are already a lot of studies which is going on with the gel and the vaginal film, the vaginal ring. There is also an injectable formulation of cabotegravir, which is again an integrase inhibitor, and studies are still going on about the efficacy of the injectable PrEP. And obviously, and then there is also implant. Now these are all, we just have to wait and watch. If something comes in like an implant or an injectable, the good thing about it is the frequency will, maybe be once in 2 or 3 months. So we just have to wait for the future options. So this is one HPTN study. So sorry, yeah, sorry. So if you want more information, you will get more information directly on the HIV Prevention Trials Network, that is the HPTN website. Now, this study, basically, they are comparing your oral Truvada combination with the injectable cabotegravir combination. We do not yet have data from about this, but it will be good to, wait and watch and see what kind of results we are going to get out of this study. So this is the cabotegravir, what it will look like. And before we finish the PrEP section, I will just emphasize on the point that please remember that PrEP is not an isolated standalone strategy. It has to work along with all the other strategies of prevention that is already in place. So PrEP cannot override any of the other strategies that we have. It is just one of the aspects of the entire prevention strategy. So with this, we finish PrEP, that is the pre-exposure prophylaxis. Like I said, we do not have it in India right now, but the studies are pretty interesting to read. So anybody, if you're interested, all the links are already given in your Canvas module, and you can just click onto it and get more details about what each study looks like or how they did it. Now, when we come to post-exposure prophylaxis, now this is something that we have in our National AIDS Control Program, and we are all already following it. So this is, and apart from the regimen, there is more or less no change in how US handles post-exposure prophylaxis and how we handle it. So if you look at the video which is uploaded by Dr. Budak, the outline of how post-exposure prophylaxis needs to be given is pretty much the same. The only thing that differs between US and India is the regimen. So it is going to be more or less the same. And I'm sure this is going to be pretty much, we can move on with this topic quickly because most of you all already know about it. So simply put, post-exposure prophylaxis, it is a comprehensive management, and it is instituted to minimize the risk of infection after there is an exposure to the bloodborne pathogen. So that was a major difference between pre and post. Here, the exposure has already happened, and now we are trying to give prophylaxis in order to prevent the infection. So who is a healthcare provider? For our benefit, or for the benefit of understanding, anybody who works in a healthcare setting and anybody who can be exposed to infectious material is called a healthcare provider. So we need not restrict ourselves just to, doctors, nurses, and lab technicians. It includes all the personnel working in any healthcare setting, because everybody is equally exposed, or that they have the potential to be exposed to infectious material. So all of us come into this category. It also includes your emergency care providers, your medical nursing students, hospital employees, and PEP can also be given in some cases where you're talking about your public safety workers or your prison staff, workers who are engaged in needle exchange programs. So the idea is anybody who has had that risky exposure is eligible for getting post-exposure prophylaxis. So why do we give PEP? Again, this is something in the first lecture that I had taken, we had seen the pathogenesis of HIV, where we spoke about how it, first it starts, has an entry to the percutaneous or the mucous membrane, and then it goes to the dendritic cells of the skin and mucosa, then it goes to your lymphatic system, and then finally leads to systemic infection. Now, this time period of when it enters your body through that mucous membrane until it, flares up to form that blow up into a systemic infection, that is the time and that is the window of opportunity that we have for post-exposure prophylaxis. During that time, if we can give the post-exposure prophylaxis, we can be successful in breaking that chain and prevent the virus, prevent the infection from setting. So that is why it is always recommended that when you're considering PEP, it must be given as soon as possible after the exposure. The sooner you give it, the better will be the impact and the effect. So when you talk about exposures, there are two basic kinds. One is the occupational exposure and one is the non-occupational exposure. So in your videos, they refer to as OPEP and NPEP. O is occupational and N is non-occupational. So it is, the word itself gives you the meaning that any exposure which happens during the performance of your work, that is here we are specifically referring to the healthcare, that is called occupational exposure. So where the healthcare personnel is at risk of, a bloodborne infection due to contact with blood or tissue or any infectious body fluid from a person who is either a known case or a suspected case of HIV. So this exposure, it can either happen through a percutaneous injury, which includes our needle stick injury or an injury with a sharp instrument. It can also happen through contact with the mucous membrane. For example, something has splashed into the eye or the nose or the mouth. Third is when there is contact with your non-intact skin, which means that you may have, say an abraded skin or a chapped skin, and that gets exposed to the infectious fluid. And finally, there could also be contact with intact skin, but the duration of contact may have been prolonged with your potential infectious body fluid. So these are the different ways in which an occupational exposure can happen. Non-occupational exposure is something that is outside the workplace setting. So for example, if there is a condom breakage or if there has been a sexual assault, these are examples which will come under non-occupational exposure. So this is again something that all of us know. What are the risky body fluids? Your blood, semen, vaginal secretions, CSF, synovial fluid, pleural fluid, peritoneal, pericardial, amniotic fluid, all these are considered at risk. And those which are not at risk are tears, sweat, urine, feces, saliva, sputum, and vomitus. But one thing to remember is these not at risk body fluids, they are considered risky as soon as they contain visible blood. So for the ease of remembering, anything that is visibly bloody is risky, irrespective of whether it is sweat or tears or saliva or whatever. But if you consider if you cannot see visible blood, then these are relatively considered as not at risk fluids. Now, this is something that we have already seen in my first lecture as well as to what is the rate of HIV transmission in each route. Here, more so, we are bothered about the needle stick exposure, which is about 0.3%. And we discussed about another route in occupational exposure, which is the mucous membrane. And there, the risk is about 0.09%. Now, please remember this 0.3 and 0.09 is for HIV. When you talk about HBV, that is hepatitis B, after a needle stick injury, the rate of transmission is as high as 9 to 30%. And for hepatitis C, it is as high as 1 to 1.8%. So please remember, do not always only think of HIV. HBV is equally risky and it is a bloodborne pathogen. So that also needs to be kept in mind. Again, so what are, the things that are more risky, or when do you have a higher chance of, when do you have a higher chance of getting the HIV infection. In what kind of exposure? So obviously, when the quantity of blood is more, when your device is visibly contaminated with blood, and suppose you are, the needle is already placed in the patient's vein, and then you have a needle stick with it, then when you're doing surgical procedure, any deeper injury, and when the exposure is to an advanced case of HIV/AIDS. So these are things where, the risk becomes more. So this is another table which is given in the video by Budak. It just sums up everything. What we are trying to see is assess the risk. So like we discussed earlier, hepatitis B has the maximum risk. HIV is around 0.3%. When you see the kind of exposure, your cutaneous and mucous membrane is about 0.09, but your percutaneous exposure can go as high as 0.23%. And obviously, there is a higher risk when your injury is deep, when the device is bloody, and when the device has already been used in the artery or the vein. So how are you going to manage this now? How are you going to manage an exposure? So these are the 6 steps, and these are the similar steps which has been discussed in the Canvas as well. First is obviously you're going to do some first aid. You have to manage the exposed site. Second, see if PEP is, the person is eligible for post-exposure prophylaxis or not. If eligible, please counsel the patient or counsel the client for PEP. And then after you assess the need, you're going to prescribe PEP. That is followed by laboratory evaluation, and then you have a follow-up of the client. So your first step is management of the exposed site. What first aid are you going to do? So these are they are simple things, but I think it is important for all of us to just revise, just so that we remember what to do. Because most of the time what happens is when there is an exposure, it is a state of panic. And we just lose our calm and we don't understand what to do. And when we lose our calm, we mostly end up doing things that we are not supposed to do. So the first thing is, whenever there is an injury and exposure, the first thing to do is try and keep calm. So if there is an exposure to the skin, that is if the skin is pierced with a needle stick or any instrument, first thing is, as a reflex, do not put it in your mouth. Secondly, immediately wash the wound and all the surrounding skin with water and soap. Do not scrub, rub, milk the wound. Do not do anything that is going to increase the friction at that site. Do not use any kind of antiseptic like alcohol, bleach, nothing. And consult your designated physician immediately. So this was for the skin. When it is eye, again, immediately wash the eye with water or normal saline. It is obvious that you're not going to use soap or disinfectant in the eye. Just use water or normal saline. Preferably sit on a chair. You have to tilt your head back and ask somebody else who's next to you to pour water or normal saline over the eye. If you're wearing contact lenses, in a jiffy, don't try to just remove the contact lenses. That will do more harm than good. So you better leave them in place, let and wash the eye. The contact lens will actually act as a barrier and it may end up protecting to some extent. And after the eye is cleaned, you may then remove your contact lenses. Now, when it comes to the mouth, spit out the fluid immediately. Again, keep rinsing the mouth with water or normal saline. And again, goes without saying, do not use a soap or disinfectant. So this is the first step. That is, you're going to give a basic first aid at the site of exposure. Now, in the second step, you have to determine the eligibility. So how will you determine whether PEP can be given or not? It is decided on the basis of 2 things. One is the HIV status of the source, and second is how severe or what is the type of exposure. So where can you give PEP? Some of the examples are like, so when you're exposed to bodily fluids that come under the risky category, which we have already discussed, or bloody stained fluids, even if they are under the non-risky category. So secondly, there is exposure to your mucous membrane. It could either be a sexual exposure or any splash to the eye, nose, mouth, or when there are parenteral exposure, like we talk about, a prick with a high caliber needle, there is a deep wound, or, the device has already been used in a patient's vein and it again comes in, it pricks you. So these are cases where you will definitely want to give PEP. What are the exposures that do not require PEP? So basically, when the exposed individual is already positive, this goes without saying. Obviously, if the exposed individual is already positive, we just have to ensure that the patient is taking ART properly. When the source is established to be HIV negative, if you know for sure that the source is HIV negative, we can, yeah, then we can uh, avoid giving PEP. And if the exposure is to body fluids, which are not risky and not bloodstained, then we may not give PEP. But one thing to remember in our scenario is we all know that in our country, every geography is different. The caseload in specific populations is different. Northeast will paint a different picture of HIV cases compared to South India. So what we need to do is we must always consider that what is the prevalence of HIV among that affected population and what is the infection burden. So if you think, like, for example, the patient may have been an IDU and the nurse comes to you that, I have a needle stick injury or whatever. Maybe the severity of exposure is not that great, but in your geography, maybe the incidence of HIV amongst IDUs is very, very, very high. So it is safe then to assume that all sources of, even though the HIV status is unknown, it is safe to assume that there is a risk of infection. So this is something that we need to decide on a case-to-case basis. But one most important thing is never delay PEP initiation until you get the result, HIV result of the source. Because many a times we know that is not something that we are going to get within half an hour or 1 hour or whatever. And like I discussed earlier, it is very crucial that PEP is started. It's a time constraint thing. So if you do not start it at the correct time, it may not be useful in future. So please do not wait in case later. So you can always initiate PrEP, and later on, if you come to know that the source is negative, depending on the case, depending on the situation, you can choose to stop PEP. So now we come to step 3. After assessing the eligibility, we have to counsel. So there has to be an informed consent. The person must be given appropriate information about what post-exposure prophylaxis is, what is the risk, what is the benefit. We must make them understand that it is not mandatory, but it is better to be taken when advised. So, and we also need to tell them when they have to follow up, when the repeat test will be done. And because many a times the PEP, whoever is coming to you for a post-exposure prophylaxis, is already emotionally traumatized. They are already panicking, and it is our role to provide that psychological support, throughout the duration of PEP until the reports come out negative. So finally, yes, we need to prescribe PEP. And for that, again, like I said, we'll have to determine whether the patient is eligible for PEP or not. Again, just to remind you, do not wait till you get the result or HIV result of the source. And in cases of sexual assault, PEP should be given to the exposed person. And that is just a part of the overall package of post-sexual assault care. And if there is a pediatric sexual assault, the cases have to be notified as per the POSCO Act. So what are the considerations? We ideally say that PEP should be started within 2 hours and definitely within 72 hours of exposure. The sooner, the better. And if the healthcare worker presents to you after 72 hours, you can still take an expert opinion, judge the nature of exposure, judge the severity of exposure. So it doesn't mean that if they come after 72 hours, you should just, blankly say no PEP. Please consider the case. It should be on a case-to-case basis. Take opinions from experts wherever you can. And depending upon, like I said, the prevalence in that region, and depending on the nature of the severity, we can decide if PEP needs to be given even beyond 72 hours. So, which also means that if you're going to give PEP so quickly, it must be available in the emergency department, in labor rooms, in intensive care units, and in OTs. And the exposed person should go to the designated officer for a complete risk assessment. There has to be proper counseling and testing, and PEP should be given. So it is important that even in your own organization, all the hospital staff should know where they have to report a case of exposure. So many a times it happens that after the exposure happens, you end up wasting time just running around not knowing whom to go to. So this is something that as an organization, wherever you are, if it is your center, your hospital, your clinic, please, I think make it just put it out in bold letters, or let there be that material everywhere where every staff knows that if there is an exposure, whom should they go to. So this is the recommended regimen that we are following in our program. This is slightly different from what United States follows or what the CDC guideline tells. What we give is tenofovir lamivudine and lopinavir ritonavir. So it is 1 tablet of tenofovir lamivudine and 2 tablets of lopinavir ritonavir, ideally within 2 hours of exposure. And from the next day onwards, it's 1 tablet of TL once daily and 2 tablets of lopinavir ritonavir taken twice daily. Now, the entire duration is for 4 weeks, that is 28 days. That is the regimen for PEP. In the upcoming guidelines, now again, we have already started TLD as a routine ART treatment, ARV treatment. But for PEP, we still have to wait for the final OM. It has already been approved as the PEP drug, but we do not have an OM from NACO to say that TLD can be given as PEP. So we will have to wait till we get the OM from NACO for us to start giving TLD as a PEP regimen. So this is the difference that I said. So in CDC guidelines, what they do is they are giving a combination of Truvada, which is tenofovir and emtricitabine, along with either raltegravir or dolutegravir. Now, again, we all know concerns. I'm sure this has been taken in your class of antiretroviral treatment, where I am sure you must have discussed in detail about dolutegravir. So according to CDC guidelines, they do not give dolutegravir in women of childbearing age. But the regimen remains the duration remains the same. It is for 28 days. And ideally, even for them, it has to be given within 72 hours of the exposure. So in children, what is recommended? We give zidovudine, lamivudine, and that is the preferred backbone of the drug. Out of the 3 drugs, zidovudine, lamivudine is the 2-drug backbone. If hemoglobin is less than 9 grams, we can give abacavir and lamivudine. And if the child is beyond 10 years of age and 30 kgs weight, we can also give tenofovir lamivudine. The 3rd drug option again is between lopinavir, ritonavir, or dolutegravir. Lopinavir ritonavir is for if the child is less than 6 years of age and weighs less than 20 kgs. And if the child is more than 6 years of age and weighs more than 20 kgs, dolutegravir is recommended as the 3rd drug. So when do we start? This is again a repetition. We have already discussed that it has to be ideally given within 2 hours of the exposure. Immediate action should be taken. And if it is given after 72 hours, there is actually little benefit according to the studies. But depending on a case-to-case basis, PEP may also be advocated post 72 hours of exposure. And there are a lot of animal studies which are done and which has come up with obvious conclusions that if you initiate PEP, the earlier the better. So if you initiate at 12 hours, it is better than if you initiate at 24 hours, which is still better if you initiate it at 36 hours and subsequently 48 and 72 hours. So the earlier, the better, act immediately. And the prophylaxis has to be continued for 4 weeks. So you can see this graph again and again, we are just stressing on the importance of why time is such a precious thing here, because you can see that as time progresses after the exposure, the benefits of PEP is, it tremendously or very quickly goes down. So beyond a point, the risk of PEP will continue to remain the same, but the benefits will hardly be any. And hence, we need to know when we need to optimally start PEP. So when it comes to laboratory evaluation, yes, we need to do a baseline. We can always, do a testing of HIV, HCV, and hepatitis, do a complete blood count, do a serum transaminase. We can also do creatinine because we're going to be giving tenofovir. And and all the exposed persons, whether even if they are not taking PEP, they must be counseled to come back for their HIV, HCV, and anti-HBsAg testing at 6 weeks, 12 weeks, and 24 weeks. So basically for follow-up, I mean, again, like I said, it is you don't wait at least for 3 to 6 weeks, we call up the patient again for monitoring. We must advocate or tell them that during this period when they are when they are on PEP, they should avoid blood donation and they must continue to use precautions and have safe sex behavior when they are on PEP. Again, please emphasize on adherence. All of us know, because I am sure as medical professionals or as people working in healthcare setting, most of us have gone through this phase where PEP was advised to us. I'm sure it was a routine occurrence, during your residency or during internship or while working with patients. We have all been exposed at some point of time or the other, and all of us know, though it is very easy to count, I mean, to tell the patients that no, you must have it. All of us know that even taking that drug for 28 days is such a big hassle. I know many of them who just stopped or gave up after 7 to 8 days saying, I cannot take this anymore. So, and we all know that if we stop taking it, it is not going to work. So the idea over here is please emphasize on adherence. They have to be adherent to the drug. Otherwise, the risk of infection is still there. So like I said, again, a follow-up, we will call them after 2 weeks, after 4 weeks, we'll be doing a CBC, urine protein, serum creat, and after 6 weeks, 12 weeks, and 24 weeks, we have to keep repeating the HIV testing. And please also consider HBV and HCV when we are thinking of the follow-up, because that also has to be addressed. So when do we take an expert opinion? Like I said, if the healthcare worker reports to you after 72 hours, please consider the situation on an individual basis and then decide, take opinions from experts. Secondly, when, we must always consider the severity of the exposure, and we must also know how the HIV epidemic is in that population. Again, when there is suspected pregnancy or when there is breastfeeding, do not delay PEP initiation. But yes, we must take opinions of experts in this regard as well. Like for example, in breastfeeding, there can be consideration where breastfeeding can be stopped for the duration when PEP is taken. Everything will depend on an case-to-case basis. So we really need to understand the context at that time and then decide what is good for the patient. Again, one most important point, if the source patient is on ART or has HIV drug resistance. So please remember now, suppose a healthcare worker comes to you with an occupational exposure or a needle stick injury, and she clearly tells that, this needle stick injury is from a patient who is already on second line ART, which means that the patient has already failed first line and he is taking medication for second line. Now, so the strain of HIV which may go into the healthcare worker is the resistant strain. So there is no point giving the regular PEP that we are giving. Hence, it is very important that if you know that the patient is already on ART, already on second line or third line, please take opinions of experts to decide what regimen should be given as post-exposure prophylaxis. So this is again very, very important in our setting, because we have a lot of people who are already admitted in the wards, they are already on second line or third line. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Now, generally, like we said, the side effects can be managed symptomatically, but yes, for some people, it might just be too overwhelming, and we need to counsel them that, these side effects are something that can be managed, and the regimen of PEP has to be continued for 28 days. So whenever there is a complicated case, whenever you are in doubt, please refer the case to experts. So with this, we conclude the post-exposure prophylaxis. Now, but again, like what is written here, post-exposure, again, it is just the second best approach to occupational exposure. What is the first or the best approach for, in cases of HIV is prevention. So prevention, I don't think I need to emphasize this anymore, especially in the pandemic that we are all living in. We all know how important it is to follow universal precautions. Now, the only thing, I'm not going to get into details of how you should wash your hands or how you should wear your PPE, don't recap needles. We know all that. The only point that I would like to emphasize is these are universal precautions, which means that suppose I know that there are patients admitted in the ward and I know which patient is HIV positive. There is no point in me taking precautions only when I go to that patient. So what I mean to say is every patient, for every patient, the universal precaution has to be taken. We cannot be selective. We can't choose. We can't say that this is when I'm going to wear a glove, this is when I'm going to wear a mask. It doesn't work like that. Because before you decide on that, time has already passed. So please take precautions. And if you're seeing somebody who is not doing something correctly, it may be your lab technician, it may be your, anybody, your pharmacist or anyone else, please advise them, please tell them. These days it is so common. We know we've seen people who don't even wear masks properly. So as a medical professional, we know what the right thing to do is. And I think it is high time that we pass on the information to others as responsible healthcare providers, and we ensure that universal precautions are in place. So these are just some figures to show you what the right methodology is. So we all know that prevention is the key step. And now to conclude the session, just about 5 minutes more, I think I'll take on what is treatment as prevention. Now, this is just, it looks like a novel concept. It is not. It is something that we are already doing. The fancy term is because right now we are in a phase where we are treating every HIV positive patient with ART. This was not the case, even few years down the line. We always had a CD4 criteria, WHO criteria, etc. Now, the reason, another big reason why we came to this treat all strategy is because now we have evidence that if we achieve viral suppression in HIV positive individuals, they cannot transmit the infection to their partners, which means we are treating the patient in one end. At the same time, we are achieving the goal of prevention as well. And that is exactly the concept of treatment as prevention. So one of the major trials which happened, which proved to us that, this can work is HPTN052. Again, it's a very, very interesting study for anybody who's interested. You can go back to your module. You can even get it on the HPTN website. It's a very good read. So again, here the concept is you are treating somebody in order to prevent the infection to the partner. So this trial was a randomized control study, and they did it in about 1,700 different heterosexual couples. And the study was done across 9 countries. And it was basically done in all persons who had, that is, the seropositive individual had a CD4 between 350 to 550 at the time of enrollment, and they did not have any HIV related symptoms. So, what was the study? Basically, it was not about giving ART and not giving ART, it was about when to give it. So, the trial demonstrated that if you start ART at the time of enrollment, that is, early initiation of ART, that reduced the rate of transmission to HIV to the uninfected partner by 96%. This was when, in comparison with, in the other arm, what they did was they waited for the CD4 to become 250 and then gave ART. So the basic difference is the sooner you begin ART, the sooner, the ARV is accepted in your body, actually fights back quickly. You can achieve viral suppression quickly, and thereby you are preventing transmission to your negative partner. So this was one of the landmark trials which, pushed for the treat all strategy as well. So like you see, there are many other studies which were done, like the partner one, where they did the study in 888 different couples, partner two, where they did it in 783 different couples. Everywhere, the idea is when you are doing, when you're initiating ART in the positive individual, so you can see the HIV transmission risk. It varies between 93, 96, 95, 95, 95. What does this mean? And there is one column called linked transmission. Now, the basic This is what I found, I mean, it's really interesting. Why? Because, for example, let us take the partner 1 study. 888 different couples were studied. And in this column, CLS means condomless sex acts. So they could account for 58,000 condomless sex acts amongst these 0 different couples. And though we say that the HIV transmission risk is 95%, the linked transmission was 0. What does that mean? It means that when we are talking about 888 different couples, obviously in the couple, there is one seropositive individual and one negative. Now, even though that 5%, for example, there were 5% cases where HIV actually occurred in spite of the positive individual taking ART. When they did a phylogenetic analysis, they came to know that these 5% infections did not come from the seropositive partner. So it actually must have come from some other partner that the seronegative individual had. I hope I'm clear. I don't want to make it complicated, but I just thought it was interesting. The point is that, so out of, like, suppose when we are looking at the study population, there was no HIV infection in the seronegative individual that came from the seropositive individual who was involved in the study group. So this 5% difference also of the risk that we are telling, that the seronegative individual contracted it from somewhere else, not from the positive partner, which again emphasizes that in all the studies, because there were 0 linked transmissions, it proves the point that undetectable equals untransmittable. If the positive individual is adherently taking ART and manages to achieve viral suppression, it is definite, most definite, that he or she will not pass on the infection to the seronegative partner. So we finally, let's just summarize what we have spoken. In PrEP, we talked about 2 regimens, which is there in the United States. One is Truvada and one is Descovy. We have to remember that regular risk assessment needs to be done. A patient need not be on PrEP lifelong. And it is important that the patient adheres to the PrEP medication. We need not worry about drug resistance, and PrEP is relatively safe. But when it comes to hepatitis B, it is important to identify if the patient has it or not before you give PrEP. When it comes to post-exposure prophylaxis, yes, timing is very, very important. It must be initiated as soon as possible. The regimen continues for 28 days. Counseling is very, very important. We must ensure that the patient is adherent to post-exposure prophylaxis, and they have to be tested regularly for HIV status as a follow-up. So please, implement the PEP plan. It is important that all the healthcare workers are sensitized about it. And finally, the concept that we can emphasize day in and day out to our patients. See, it's a very catchy message. U is equal to U is a very catchy message. So it is something, and it gives a booster of confidence to the client, just to make them understand that, you can continue to keep your partner negative. I think that itself will be a big motivation for them to be adherent on treatment. We all have problems when it comes to treatment adherence, but I think if we can convey this message correctly to our client, it can serve as a big motivation for them to maintain good ART adherence. So prevention is primary. Please protect yourself, protect people around you. And like I said, prevention is for your own self. You're not doing it for anybody else. Nobody is going to check on you whether you're wearing the glove properly or the mask properly. It is for your own self. So please stay safe. Please be careful. And with this, I conclude my session. If there are any questions, I will take it up.
Thank you, ma'am. Participants can now unmute themselves if they have any questions.
I'll wait for a couple of minutes and
yeah ma'am.
And if there is anything, I mean, even for the participants, if there is any other doubt or any other need, I mean, anything that you need to understand more, you can always contact us on the WhatsApp group or on mail, and we'll obviously get back.
Madam, I just wanted to know one thing.
Yeah.
There used to be those categories, category 1 to 4, when person used to the source and index used to be put in some categories of exposure, and when the person used to be, we used to say that he is in category 1 to 4. It used to be very easy to tell the person that, see, you don't stand, actually, you're not in the risk. You should not take PEP. It becomes, if that, have you done away with that actually? I mean,
yeah,
or you
actually,
still-
see, the point is now we have a universal regimen, right? The only place where PEP need not be given is when you confirm no that the HIV source is negative. So that is why we have gone. In fact, it was actually turning out to be more confusing for people because, you know, they were not clear about the exposure code, whether you see, because it was the category was small volume of blood, large volume of blood. Nobody knew where to draw the line. So that's why now it becomes even more easier, because what we are only looking at is two things. One is how severe is the exposure, and secondly, what is the source status. So if that is clear, and if you for sure know that the patient is negative, you need not give PEP. For any other case, then, you know, because if it is unknown, like even if the source status is unknown, but there is risk, then you would anyways advocate PEP. So actually we have done away with that. The reason for that is because we were not able to categorize very clearly. There was no quantum definition as to who comes under which exposure. So, you know, so this becomes easier. And another thing is there is no change in regimen. The regimen still remains the same. So this kind of, you know, assessment becomes easier.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think regarding your assignments, when are they supposed to give it, Shweta? Monday, or there's no deadline?
There's no deadline. You can
Okay.
always do it by June 20th. But see to it that it is completed within that timelines. And one more request I have already made on the WhatsApp group. If you can share your grades with me individually as a personal message, so that even we can keep a track as to if we need to follow up with any of the participants, give more reminders or something like that.
Yeah.
If you have already shared the grades, the remaining can share it by tomorrow evening. It's fine.
Yeah. And please don't take the assignment. Like I said, I think you all have only 1 month to go. So, I mean, just 4 more modules. So please catch up on your assignments, because I think if you push it on to the last moment, it becomes very taxing. So whenever you find time, please try to finish the respective quizzes as and when. So I think we can wrap up, Shweta.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for your time, and please stay safe, all of you. Please stay safe. Yeah. Thank you.